is Joshua DuBois, and I'll be your host for the next 20 minutes. I'm going to start this conversation with a couple of statistics for us to think about. Although the overall population numbers are obviously dramatically different than they were back then, there are still more African Americans in the corrections system today than there were slaves in 1850. These issues start early. Black youth are nearly 3 times as likely to be suspended or expelled from our elementary schools and our middle schools and our high schools for the exact same offenses as their peers. And according to a 2012 report from the Children's Defense Fund, every year, black youth account for nearly half of all deaths from gun violence. At the same time, as we saw in the video, black men are striving against the odds every single day, with graduation rates slowly ticking up and fathers becoming involved in their families and an increasing number of leaders and organizations engaging on these issues. When it comes to black men in this country, there's a lot that should trouble us, but also a lot that should inspire us and give us hope. So we have got a lot to talk about today. I'm pleased to be on stage with Joseph Jones, the founder of the Center for Urban Families in Baltimore. CFUF is a service organization that helps low-income families achieve stability and success with a special focus on preparing fathers. Joe was also featured in the Newsweek Daily Beast cover story that I wrote called The Fight for Black Men that really sparked a new conversation about black men in America growing out of Joe's story. Joe, welcome to the Hero Summit stage.
Joshua, thank you, and thank you to the Daily Beast.
Now, Joe, as I said, the Fight for Black Men piece was really anchored around your story. You're one of the most brilliant guys that I know. You lead one of the country's most effective nonprofit organizations. You've been applauded by everyone from the mayor of Baltimore to Maryland's governor to even receiving a visit from the president of the United States. But you were not always in these lofty positions. In fact, you started in a very different and very difficult place, a place that you've described to me before as your madness. Tell us about that madness, Joe. Tell us about that place where you started.
Well, 2 quick things. I want to thank all the servicemen and women. I've been here since 8 o'clock this morning, and I've just been so inspired by the stories of our military servicemen and women who've given so much to our country. Thank you. And secondly, one of the most significant things that ever happened in my life happened on August 31st of this year when he transitioned from bachelorhood to marital bliss. So congratulations to you and your lovely bride, Michelle. This is a personal story, but it's not about the story. It's about really the transition. I grew up in Baltimore in the projects with my mom and dad. My dad split when I was 9 years old. My mom and dad never had a conversation with me about that departure. Simply, he rolled, and I became the product of a single mom raising a only child who happened to be a black male in the urban community. And at age 13, very confused, very hurt, feeling like I was abandoned, but didn't really understand it at that time. I engaged with a group of older kids in the neighborhood, and I didn't drink alcohol, I didn't smoke marijuana, I hadn't had sex, but I picked up a hypodermic needle full of heroin, and I injected it in my arm, and for 17 years, I was in and out of incarceration, and one of the worst heroin and cocaine addicts in Baltimore City. So that's how it got started and where it led to.
And so much of that, Joe, was, it's interesting, your story is so complex. Your grandfather ran a small business, and you came from a stable family, but then something happened, and so much of that was centered around one morning when your dad did something. Tell me about that morning. I know we get into it in the piece, but tell me about that.
Yeah, it was a typical day. I'm an only child again. My mother and father are married. We're in the projects. We're poor, but I don't realize we're poor because I got a mom and dad who are tag teaming raising their only child. I literally had no spare time when one of my parents or both of them weren't around. And so this one morning, he gets up and he's ex-military. My dad, he's ex-military. So you military folks, y'all don't throw away your old uniforms or the duffel bags. So he packed his duffel bag full of clothes. I actually thought he may be going to the laundromat. And he left out. I looked out of the living room window, and he got into an old Thunderbird that was his car, and he never returned. And I used to spend days when he would call the house. I would assume that he and my mom were trying to, iron out family business. And I would tell my mom that my dad said that he wants to come back. And I would tell my dad that my mom said she wants him to come back. None of it was true, but that was a little guy trying to negotiate this, this breakup.
And that morning, when he hopped into that Thunderbird, it really kicked off this cycle of drug abuse and some other destructive issues that occurred for 17 years. But it's a cycle that you eventually emerged from in a pretty spectacular way. What helped you come out of that period? What were some of the factors that brought you out of that cycle?
Well, it's an accumulation of things. If you think about it from a boxing analogy, you got Mike Tyson who can knock somebody out with one punch. I never got the one punch knockout. I got the Muhammad Ali continuous jab of just hellacious things happening to me. Largely, they were self-inflicted, but I did try to stopped going to jail. I just couldn't. I was addicted. Every criminal justice institution I went to up and down the East Coast, I was able to find the drug of my choice, a hypodermic needle, and inject it in a criminal justice institution. So to think that we can incarcerate ourselves out of these kind of problems without drug treatment is just ludicrous. I was fortunate enough in 1986 to land a drug treatment slot in a residential facility where I stayed a year. The ironic thing was the place was over capacity. The way that you got in, you had to write a letter asking for admission, and there was a 6-month waiting list. But the word on the street was if you feigned mental health illness, you could get in. So I acted like I was crazy, and that allowed me to, circumvent the system and get in. And I was really going in not to stop using drugs primarily, although there was a part of me that wanted to stop. I really was facing a 5-year jail sentence, and I didn't want to go back to jail again. I could handle jail. I wasn't afraid of jail. I just didn't want to go anymore. And as a result of getting in and being able to stay in for a year, about 3 months in, I began to feel better about myself physically, mentally, spiritually, and haven't looked back since with a lot of support, not just from the treatment community, but from the God of my understanding and other people in my life, including my mom.
And you now provide that same sort of support, and we're going to get back to that support question in a bit, but you now provide that to men and women in some of the most the toughest neighborhoods in Baltimore through the Center for Urban Families. Talk to me about what the Center for Urban Families does for folks who are in situations like you were in.
So the Center for Urban Families is a nonprofit I founded in 1999. Next year will be our 15-year anniversary. For those of you in the nonprofit sector, keeping the doors open for 15 years uninterrupted is a major, major challenge. I'm very proud of that. But at the center, thank you. At the center, we work with young men from Baltimore who happen to be disconnected from their children or at risk from being disconnected from their children, mainly because the relationship with the mom has disintegrated or the relationship is so tenuous, relative to the economic situation. They're not having a support network to learn how to strengthen the relationship between the mom and the dad. And then the second thing we do is to get men and women into the labor force. And we're talking about taking people off the streets of Baltimore, regardless of their backgrounds, asking them to do the kind of things, to dress the way that Joshua and I are dressed. Matter of fact, Joshua would be underdressed because he doesn't have a tie on. So the guys have to have on a tie, and the women have to have commensurate, appropriate dress attire, and it's non-negotiable. And we take them through a relatively long process over the course of 2 years, getting them first off the street, changing minds and behavior, getting them connected to the labor force, and following them long-term to move up the wage scale.
Now, Joe, even before you transition these men and women into these programs, there's something that happens at kind of the baseline level. You get to know them and you like them. And I use that phrasing because it's something that Jeffrey Canada from the Harlem Children's Zone says all the time. He says, you can't help people if you don't like them, and you're never going to like them if you don't know them. Why is it tough for so many Americans to get to know black men? And what is it about black men that Americans need to know?
Well, if you think about Joshua when he was a little baby, and you think about me when I was a little baby, we were cute and cuddly. At least our parents thought we were, right? But you fast forward to now, neither one of us are cute and cuddly, except maybe to our wives, right?
Speak for yourself, Joe.
Well, Michelle. And some of the life circumstances that lead black men to survive on the street don't necessarily lead to the kind of engagement and interpersonal engagement that is understood by many folks. So the hardness that we depict in our faces and our behavior and mannerisms are counter to mainstream culture and behavior, and it's misunderstood. And I had to learn personally how to smile again. right? How to engage people, how to look somebody in the eye, even with my deficiencies and my character defects, because I'm no less or no better than anybody else, but I had to learn how to overcome that. And so, Joshua, your question about getting these guys to understand they are valuable assets in our community, but also understand how you transition from a street environment where those attributes are looking hard are the kind of things that can get you, get you through the day, to transition to a new environment where we can engage folks like here at the Mellon Center to talk about black men in a very asset-based way.
So it's a cultural disconnect there.
Very much so.
Now, there are organizations that are kind of coming together now in this particular moment, or after Trayvon Martin, after the president's remarks on race, the piece, and in sort of a coalition, an umbrella. Talk to me about what's happening now in the field of black male achievement.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited about the prospects for black men, our families, and the American society as a whole with respect to the plight of black men, that we're changing with a network of organizations, individuals that are inclusive of every facet of American society, not just black men, but white men, women, people with from different ethnicities, all around this notion of black male achievement. We've been fortunate enough through the Open Society Foundation, which many of you may know is founded by philanthropist George Soros, who invested in a large portfolio called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. And through that portfolio, we have engaged a group of national funders throughout the country, researchers, policymakers, and others who are looking to find ways to create pathways out of darkness into the light for black men, their families, and particularly our black boys and our young girls who are finding that without fathers engaged in their lives, they struggle more than any other peer group. Without the policy, tenets that say, let's not expel kids and put them out of school for minor infractions, when it drops them out of a school setting and into our juvenile justice, our child welfare systems. And those are the kind of things that we're working on to make sure that kids stay connected to schools, connected to their families, and help their families to build up strength and assets in places and ways in which they didn't have before.
So it's under the umbrella of the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. Let's dig a little bit into the criminal justice system now, because it's such a big part of this conversation. It's such a hot topic on the Hill now, and with Attorney General Holder's recent remarks. Now, it's fascinating to me, Joe, just knowing a little bit about your story, that you spent a lot of time incarcerated, and yet the correction system was not corrective at all for you. Go into that a little bit, and talk about the first time you were incarcerated and what that did in terms of your spiral from there.
So I started injecting heroin when I was 13, and age 14 was the first time that I was actually incarcerated. I was sent away for 30 days into a juvenile facility, and I was really scared. I'm really not a tough guy by any stretch of the imagination. I can't even dance, right? But when I got to that institution, very much afraid, there was a guy who was there who was from my neighborhood who I hadn't seen in a while. We were very good, associates on the street. And when I walked into the facility being scared, he shouted out my name. And he was sort of like one of those people who was, he was a little tougher than me, right? And he had sort of like control of that environment. So he gave me a smooth pathway into that institution. It was the worst thing that could ever happen, because I no longer had that fear of being sent away for the first time. And I learned things each time that I was incarcerated. I learned how to be a better criminal. Right? It's sort of like if I had gone to Tuskegee, if I had gone to Morgan State University, Yale University, I would learn different things just by being on campus, right? I was in a different campus, a different environment, and I learned how to be better at my craft, although it was very negative and counterproductive to what we would want anybody in our society to be.
So incarceration is, in many ways, the worst things you can do to stop this cycle of crime. Joe, let's talk a little bit about fatherhood. Obviously, your father was a big part of your own story, and you're a proud father yourself. Joe's son is going to be graduating with a degree in engineering from Morgan State University next year.
Y'all got to give me a hand for that one, right? My wife will tell you it's because of her, and I'll tell you it was because of me, but really because of the both of us.
So talk to me about the role of fatherhood in the black community, where we are now with black fatherhood and where we can go.
Well, the reality of it is, in the United States of America, we have approximately 25 million children who live in households where dads aren't present. That's across the ethnic spectrum, right? And that's according to the Annie Casey Foundation. However, that's more pronounced in the African American community. And so what we're doing is we're creating pathways for children to grow up fatherless. And if you took the folks in this room, I would suspect that the majority of the folks in this room have had a meaningful, sustained relationship with your own dad. And for those of us in this room who happen to be dads, with your own children. In the African American community, it's the exact opposite. So the pathway for these kids is not to have a relationship with a dad. That means if the dad is absent, that child is going to have a relationship with some other person that fills that void. And for the folks that grow up in the urban communities, not just Baltimore, but across the country, we find that gangs fill that void in many ways. We find that other negative influences fill that void. And you have little children who grow up through, early childhood, adolescence, and they take on the attributes of that influence. And wouldn't it be much better if we found a way to invest in the uplift of responsible fatherhood to get men to take their rightful roles with the appropriate behavior so that they can help instill the values and beliefs in their children?
And
that's
Joe,
what we're trying to achieve.
That investment is happening in a lot of ways now. This is we've talked about some of the nonprofit organizations, but in terms of the policy landscape and the funding landscape, this is an exciting time. There's a bill that you helped co-author in the Maryland legislature that I'd like for you to talk about, but also sort of what's happening with some mayors around the country as well. Talk about the policy landscape here.
Yeah, over the last 3 administrations, from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration and now to the Obama administration, we've increased awareness and resources into communities to uplift fathers, not pitting dads against moms, but to help dads play a complementary role in raising their children with moms. And so those investments are now devolved down to states, and so we have many states across the country who are involved in this, and that plays out in the nonprofit sector. And we've gotten the federal government to partner with philanthropy, so that they're now co-investments of finding more ways in which we can work with poor families, particularly poor dads across every color, but particularly black dads in particular because of the issues that impact black males in our country.
Joe, if folks here wanted to get involved in these issues, what are some steps that you would suggest that they take?
One, I would suggest that they go to the Open Society Foundation's website, the opensocietyfoundations.org, and they also go to the website of the Black Male Achievement Funders.org. This is a coalition of foundations and others that are investing in strategies, resources, and approaches, including policy investments to change around the trajectory of the lives of black men and boys.
In general, and we're wrapping up, but is the fight for black men a fight that can be won? I mean, we're sort of laden with these difficult statistics, these challenges, but I also see a lot of hope out there as well. What makes you hopeful in this space, Joe? What encourages you, and why do you continue this fight?
I'm very encouraged because I have faith in the American people. Right? Not just black people, but white people and everybody that makes up the melting pot here in our country, the folks in this room, the folks who are listening, who aren't here. When I grew up, the black family had 3 photographs on the wall. There's a picture of Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, and Jesus Christ, right? That was the black family, right? And I think it's the attributes of all 3 of those pictures that have me believing in the power of our advocacy, the power of our faith, the power that collectively we can invest in an issue that's impacting one demographic in our country. In this case, we happen to be talking about black males. And if we can do that, then if white males were impacted this way, I think we would need to coalesce around them as well. In this case, we're impacted in ways in which many of us don't understand, but collectively our will and our interest and our intellect can solve this problem and have men going from liabilities to assets in our communities.
Great. Let's thank Joe Jones for his tremendous work. And I think we're heading into a break now. Thank you.